power levels are not mentioned in the Local Community Radio Act. The Local Community Radio Act was written to address the issuing of insuring licenses for Lpfm. There's lots of other issues related to Lpfm that aren't discussed in the bill, like power levels, but also operating hours, antennas, programming, and everything else the FCC has the authority to determine. I just want to make the argument for you that 250-watt service is still a very localized service compared to the 50,000 and 100,000-watt full-power stations. So, in fact, translator stations routinely operate at 250 watts at greater tower heights than Lpfm without any problems. So I guess my question is, as long as Lpfms are still required to operate under the same very strict interference protections required by the Local Community Radio Act, what difference would it make if Lpfms run at a higher power level as long as they don't interfere with neighboring stations?
Mr. Doyle, that would be comparable to if I have a radio station that has 25,000 watts of power, but it wouldn't interfere with someone, so I could arbitrarily increase that power to whatever level I could reach my contours without causing interference. That's not the way the system has been devised. That's not the way the system is operated. There are classes of stations. You have maximum power within each of those classes of stations, and that's how the FCC has operated for years. It's not get as much space or coverage as I can. It's operate a particular class of radio.
Sure, but you acknowledge translators run at 250 watts and there's not interference problems.
Yes, sir. It's a different class of station.
Yeah, I understand, but I'm just saying that since we already know that translators run at that wattage without causing interference problems, it wouldn't be an interference issue. I mean, if the issue is interference, do you think that somehow a low-power FM station operating at 250 watts would cause interference that a translator wouldn't?
Well, I think the issue is what the intent of the Act of 2010 was, that the NAB did go on record supporting and we advocated for, and that was that these were to be micro stations that covered particular neighborhoods, a 100-watt station at 100 feet, and that is what the class of station that was authorized by that act.
Thanks.
And that would be NAB's position, just asking that that spirit of that legislation be continued.
Thank you. Let me ask you about the second adjacent frequency waivers, too. The Act says that the FCC may only grant an Lpfm station a second adjacent waiver if that station, and I'll quote the Act, will not result in interference to any authorized radio service. So a second adjacent frequency waiver cannot be granted to an Lpfm station that might cause interference to any radio station, no matter how far away, even outside that station's protective listening range. And if interference somehow happens anyway, the Lpfm must suspend operations immediately. This is a much stronger standard than full power stations have to abide by. So what I want to ask, in your written testimony, you propose that a full power station should be able to review the second adjacent waiver application of an Lpfm station. This is on top of the already exhaustive interference protections that are enacted by the Local Community Radio Act. I'm just curious why you find it necessary to have that extra layer of scrutiny.
It goes back to the principle of the concerns of the degradation of the quality of the audio band. You can look at what happened to the AM band in this country and see why the NAB was so protective of the second adjacent channels. Third adjacent does provide enough separation between the stations that it avoids an unintended consequence of interference. Second adjacent does cause more interference. That is a fact of physics.
But you acknowledge the Act requires them to shut down immediately if that's the case.
Right. And what we're asking is that broadcasters have the opportunity to be proactive and avoid that problem so that our listeners are not, that the listeners are not interfered with their habits of listening to our station.
But our experience has been that translators, which are higher than 100 watts, that only about 5% of translators have had to move or go off the air as a result of this kind of scenario that you're describing. So I'm just curious, you know, since it doesn't seem to be a big problem and we've not had any issues with it or very few issues with it, why you see the need for the extra layer of scrutiny. But I see my time is run out. And
I'd let you respond.
Yeah, if you want to.
I would respond again by saying a different class of stations with different license intentions through the Act of 2010.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Doyle.